Everyone is really jumpy. Jumpy does not even do justice for it.
Hey everyone, today I'm joined by a true expert on AI and emerging tech. Azeem Azhar is an analyst, investor, and the founder of Exponential View, a research group that advises tech leaders, government ministers, and more. I'm an avid reader of Azeem's newsletter, so it's a treat to have him on the show. Azeem is bullish on AI, but not blindly so. I appreciate his nuanced takes, so I push him on whether AI can truly be profitable. He says the next 18 months are crucial and companies will need to prove that there is real ROI in AI. And even though he says it's hard to figure out, I ask him to pick who the winners might be.
If you look at previous general purpose technologies, the winners were in odd places.
And AI ROI or not, can the electric grid withstand the load, and especially, can America's? Plus, Azeem shares how he and his team use AI and how it's changing work itself. Welcome to Future Around and Find Out, where we celebrate the breakthroughs called BS on the Hype and explore how things might go sideways and how we, together, can steer the future in the right direction. Hi, I'm Dan Blumberg. I'm an independent technologist and former NPR journalist, and on the show, you'll hear sharp takes on what builders need to know now. Learn more, sign up for the newsletter, and ask questions of upcoming guests at futurearound.com.
I loved your review of the MIT Nanda paper, which
Because I actually read it.
I read it too.
Yeah.
I think the fact you can only download it from a crypto exchange gives you... That's an aside. Let's get straight into Future Around and Find Out.
I do want to get into Future Around and Find Out. I am curious, though, because the reaction to that MIT study, which both of us think the methodology was poor, it kind of fit the vibes of the moment. People are jumpy right now. I think they're looking for signs that, there's a bubble or a bust. You've launched a live, is this a bubble tracker? Mm-hmm. And you've also written that the next 18 months are the crucible for AI. And I'd love for you to explain why and what it is that AI optimists need to prove to show that this massive, massive investment in chips, energy, data centers, tokens, et cetera, can generate a return that's even bigger than that.
I mean, everyone is really jumpy. Jumpy does not even do justice for it. Why does 18 months matter? It matters because it just takes time for companies to adopt any sort of technology. And normally we would say, look, you need 2 to 2.5 years before the smartest companies get started in enough numbers to pull a team together, to build a few products, to make some mistakes, to get some early evidence, and then to roll it out across the organization. I mean, that even in a really fast-moving organization is not going to happen overnight. And so when should we start that starting gun? And I think that starting gun should start in October 2023. It's when Microsoft and Google really started to make widely available enterprise tools. So about a year after ChatGPT was born. And so you just add, well, that's when the tool is available. The first projects start in early 24. They're staffed up by the second quarter of 24. And you add 2.5 years and you get to the middle of 2026. And I think that is the moment where it's reasonable to say we should see more evidence than just JP Morgan and BNY and Klarna and the same old case studies being trotted out time and time again. And we just have to be a little bit patient to see whether that's really, really happening. And I think, like you, I hear a lot of mixed signals. I mean, I hear a lot of people saying this is difficult. I hear lots of other people saying we're doing great things, and trying to sort through that noise without real hard data is just going to turn into a tribal debate, which I think is what we've seen over the last year or so.
Yeah. So what is the hard data that you'll be looking at to see, is there real ROI here?
The thing that I think really matters is companies, because we're talking about AI as a general purpose technology. So it has to improve the productivity within our economy. So company level data becomes important. And so that should be many, many firms in their official earnings announcements saying, we put out this Gen AI productivity tool to improve our sales force, and we've seen a 40% improvement in Salesforce efficiency that has increased our revenues by this much, and we got this kind of payback period from it. And now we're going to move on to our second, third, and fourth project. And we need to see a lot of those, in the sort of dozen plus or more, showing that those early companies are really starting to get results. That's really distinct to things like, well, token volumes have risen. That's useful, but that's not really sort of value.
I cringed so much just recently when I saw OpenAI sending like congratulations, like certificates to people, like congratulations, you've used a bajillion tokens. They were
Right.
I don't know if you saw this, they were sending these out.
Yeah.
That is the wrong, that's measuring outputs. That is not measuring outcomes at all.
Exactly. It's measuring outputs, and what we really need are the outcomes. So I think those sort of really hard measures, the way that Jamie Dimon has talked about what generative AI products and the LLM suite has done for JP Morgan, is what we need to see from other companies and across industries. But Dan, one of the things I think is quite difficult is that I suspect that a lot of people are benefiting from using this, not through the applications that their companies have created and built for them, but actually just by taking the chatbot and applying it to the problem that they face today, whether it's helping them build a spreadsheet, whether it's helping them prioritize a series of items for a product backlog, whether it's getting it to review and summarize and pull out insights across a bunch of customer conversations. My sense is that those things actually work straight out of the box on ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, and they might be ahead of the curve than whatever enterprise IT can shift. And I think that's going to be a problem in 9 months when we come back and say, hey, is this thing really working?
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to something that you've written a lot about, which is picking the winners is going to be really hard here. I mean, AI could be, it's a general purpose technology, and it's not clear who is going to win. I'm going to ask you anyway, what companies, what types of companies do you think can build a moat with AI?
Let me answer with a story first, and I will answer your question directly. If you look at previous general purpose technologies, the winners were in odd places, right? So with telecoms and digital telecoms, it wasn't the companies that laid the fiber, it was the application vendors, Meta and Google, who made the bulk of the revenue and the bulk of the profits. If you look at the internal combustion engine, the car companies made about 35% of the profits, but at lower margins than the financing companies and the oil companies, who roughly made between 25 and 30% of the profits. So, what was it about the internal combustion engine that meant both downstream and upstream you had profits? And with fiber, it was all downstream, right? Down at the application end. So when we think about AI, I'm not sure we necessarily know, but I would just go to hazard like a few guesses. So one would be companies that have structural data advantages. So data that might be permissioned or would be really, really hard to get. So a company like that might be, Waymo in knowing how pedestrians behave and how to traverse all the streets in the US, or it might be somebody who really has access to distinct manufacturing or industrial data, and they can build a model on there that you could never learn from just sort of by reading text or doing reinforcement learning. Another area would be anything that's touching a workflow that can become a choke point. The thing about having a workflow and living in a workflow is that the person who owns the workflow can swap out the model whenever they want. Whereas if you're the model, you are just the swappee. So if we think about AI, where is the moat and who's going to do well? I think structural data advantages will make a really big difference. So if you've got data about how cars drive, pedestrians work, and an understanding of the roads, you will build an AI system that can do what Waymo does, and it's hard to do that. And there might be other sources of that structural data, like within industrial processes. Another place will be within workflows, especially if the workflow is important for the customer. So if you've built something that does something for a business, you can always swap out the model, but the business customer can't swap out your workflow. And so you really want to figure out ways where you do own that workflow. And at some point, because you're there, you might want to feed custom data back into whatever model you're using or model layer you're using. But a model on its own, I think, just sits there waiting for the cost curve to decline and the capability curve to improve and be swapped out. And I'm sure, you and many of the listeners like me have swapped models out of the workflows we've built as new ones emerge, or cheaper ones emerge that operate at the sort of same level of quality.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me very nervous if I'm OpenAI or Anthropic, or, pick your model maker. How do they, I know they're trying a variety of things. They're launching products. They're trying to get proprietary data. They're trying to know me better than anyone else can know me. I mean, are those the vectors on which they can win?
I think they're doing different things, and they're approaching it in a different way. What I see Anthropic doing is building this really powerful spike around coding, and around the whole stack of sort of software architecture to working code. And it's really impressive, right? If you use Claude Code directly, or you use it through one of these apps, it's getting more and more powerful, and that becomes an anchor in, because that's the thing that developers then want. And developers are people too. They develop affiliations, right, to
Yeah.
the products they use. And it is a bit of a badge of pride. It reminds me a little back about 20 years ago, when Apple was really on its knees, and developers were still using Macs because they loved the sort of Unix heritage of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that for me was a sense that Apple was going to survive. In fact, I wrote an essay about that some 20 years ago on exactly that point. So I think that Claude's approach is slightly different. And one argument they might make is that the art of software is about translating the squishy real world and what humans want into mechanistic code that gets some digital product to do that thing. If you're going to choose any skill to master, it should be software programming, because it's software programming that ultimately gave us command completion and LLMs and Photoshop. So that's a great place to start. So I think that's what Anthropic is doing, and they're choosing to put more and more of their eggs behind that particular basket. It also might help them, because if you become really good with your own tool at writing software, you can then get through the product manager's backlog much faster, and all the other things that were perhaps less important for you. What OpenAI is doing is, it reminds me of the Netscape strategy. So just let's go back to 1994 and Mark Andreessen and Jim Barksdale and Jim Clark.
I think Lycos is open on my browser right now. Go on.
Yeah, is it? Oh, okay, very good. I'm on zap.com, which was Zapata Fish Oil's short-lived internet portal. And there was a guy called Mike Homer, who was the VP of marketing, and he adopted a ubiquity strategy. So what Netscape did was they made themselves ubiquitous. They made themselves a consumer brand. They did enterprise licenses for the browser. They pushed themselves everywhere, because I think that the lesson was a billion of anything is a lot. And what I see OpenAI starting to do is something similar to that. So they've announced all of these enterprise deals with like Emirates Airlines and Accenture. They've obviously got the most popular chatbot. They're trying to build the social hooks in, so you can now do social chats around conversations with the chatbot, which hasn't worked for me yet, but maybe it will. And they've also, as you say, tried to build in persistence. And they have this great product called Pulse. So I sort of fell in love with Pulse, because what it did was, knowing my history, it looked out for things that I might be interested in. And that included a new product that I'm building. And I would get these amazing alerts that it had scanned every morning. So I was checking my Pulse feed the way you might check your WhatsApp or your Instagram DMs. But what I noticed with Pulse was that it wasn't quite a complete product. So I'd been using it for a couple of months, and it wasn't improving. And when I think about what OpenAI is trying to do, that ubiquity strategy is really hard, even when you've got infinite resources. When you don't have infinite resources, it's, I think, almost impossible. So when I looked at OpenAI, I was thinking, Pulse doesn't quite do it. And when Gemini Pro was released, it was so good that I just started to move lots of my work, despite the fact that ChatGPT had my memories and it had Pulse. Look, Sam Altman is an exceptional product entrepreneur. He's got brilliant people with him, like Kevin Weil and Fiji Simo, who are have a much stronger track record than I have. So, with that kind of humility in mind, I'm a bit confused about this spread it thin strategy that they have taken, rather than, let's just put a lot of wood behind a single arrow and, punch through that door.
Let's talk more about coding agents. You brought up Claude Code already. On the one hand, a lot of CTOs I've spoken to And it sounds like for you from personal experience, like you're using things like Claude Code and they're amazing and they're a game changer. I've also spoken to folks who say they're just, quote, good enough. They're good enough, but they have to be, there's a lot of babysitting, and not babysitting by a junior engineer, but babysitting by a senior engineer to make sure it doesn't introduce vulnerabilities or bugs or other things. What are you seeing here in terms of the progress? Are these agents going to be able to do the last 10%, or is that going to always be 5 years away?
Well, I think it depends on what the last 10% is. I've worked with exceptional developers. I'm a really mediocre developer, and I don't even deserve the title developer. I'm a guy who can copy and paste code
Well,
out
the
of libraries,
definition of developer is changing
right,
rapidly right now,
and
so
get little things to
don't
run.
sell yourself short.
With the very best developers I've worked with, I would say that Claude Code does do the last 10%, by which I mean the last 10% of tasks they really, really don't want to do. Like,
Got it.
yeah, documentation and all the boring bits like single sign-on, right? They want to do the hard things. Like, here is a computational problem where I'm kind of trading off a whole set of different constraints, and this system is a parallel system, and I need to figure out how to break this apart and make sure that I'm not introducing unnecessary latency or creating race conditions. I mean, these are the things that great developers like to think about. And the things that they really don't like thinking about are SOC 2 compliance. And so I would say that in a way, what we're seeing with these tools is they're enabling people to crunch through a lot of that work. Now, I do recognize because I've heard it from engineering leaders as well, that it's not so straightforward, that you actually have to change the way in which teams work. That is the bit that means that trial of product through to like deep absorption and deep use often takes a bit more time. But it's also undeniable, I think, that the quality of these tools is getting better and better. And software development isn't ultimately just about the thing that the master developer commits on the very last day of the project. There's no last day, it's ongoing.
Right.
It's as much about the pointy-haired boss knowing what they want. And the beauty about things like Claude Code and Gemini and Replit is that the pointy-haired boss can now do a much better job in trying to specify what harebrained product they actually want built. And I think that does something in the product development life cycle and the software life cycle that I would hope would actually improve that life cycle, because the conversations are much, much more real. They're not just about sketches on a whiteboard or angry emails. They are about a boss saying, listen, I've done the mock-up. I've tried to create something that's clickable, that's useful, that almost gets where I need to take this feature and why that connects to customer value. And that feels like it's a richer prototype around which a development team and a UX team could then have a conversation.
I think for prototyping, it's incredible. I don't think anyone's really arguing with that. I think that's going to be hard to measure. That leads to, again, back to the question of like, what are we measuring that AI is having a massive impact on the economy? I think it's hard to measure. And the reason specifically that I asked about coding agents is because that is one of the primary things that people are really paying a lot for.
Right.
And yet still the unit costs are not great. If disillusionment about coding agents takes root or spreads, it could really have a big knock-on effect to the whole AI economy, which kind of is bolstering much of the big economy.
Yeah, everyone's jittery, but coding agents, I do think, are they're at that point where people have had a long, long time to cancel their subscriptions and to pull them out. And as a sector, they got to about $3 billion in revenue during 2025 from nothing really 2 or 3 years earlier. And the one area where there's increasing amounts of data from a wider number of companies saying, well, we're producing 70%, 80, 90% of our code through these agents now. We are seeing developer productivity uplifts. We are getting through backlogs far faster, like the real hard nuts and bolts of it. Now, of course, we also have the data and the case studies of companies saying, actually, we're finding it harder. We can't demonstrate that the additional lines of code are actually turning into better or cheaper products. And of course, there was that great study, which I think Epoch may have done, where they they looked at engineers who were using coding agents and those who weren't. And the ones who used coding agents thought that they had worked faster and at a higher quality, and the data was actually the reverse.
Oh, really?
So you do have these confounding bits of data that are emerging. I think the thing that I would say is, like, common sense suggests that if you have this type of smart autocomplete, that at some point you'll be able to find ways of going faster. And I'm old enough to remember the time when object-oriented programming wasn't really a thing. IBM had Pink and Blue as two projects in the late 80s, early 90s. And this notion that you might just be able to kind of move blocks around very quickly and construct sort of interface definitions around your classes and so on was not really commonplace. And then we get to the world of Git repositories and Stack Overflow, and the way in which people build apps is completely different. Well, which interface library am I going to use? And I remember the days when, years ago, right, we started to use React.js rather than whatever else we were using before. I mean, that is a completely novel approach, which is now absolutely widely accepted. So I think the notion that this couldn't add to productivity feels to me a little bit far-fetched. The idea that people are struggling to make sense of it right now and having mixed effects seems completely normal as we stand right at the sort of foothills of this wave.
As excited as we can all get about AI, and let's stipulate that there are incredible gains that can be had here, there are, and you've written a lot about this, real physical constraints: chips, data centers, power plants, water, energy. What are the questions that leaders of tech organizations should be asking right now as they figure out how to make these multi-year investments?
Wow. It's a really hard question. And I think they have done a pretty good job. I have heard very senior execs at some of the what we now call hyperscalers. We just used to call them software companies 5 years ago. Now they're hyperscalers.
Yeah.
Talk
Sounds
about
cool.
how difficult the planning is, because you're having to order 2 years in advance against a particular exponential curve, against what Jensen tells you his chips might be able to do, given some uncertainty about when they might be delivered. And the physical infrastructure is going to vary depending on whether you get H100s or GB200s in there. And at the same time, usage is growing, as we saw the last 2 or 3 years, 200, 300, 400% per year. So even a 5% variance in that changes the outcome significantly. So I would put that question to those bosses, because I think they are the only ones who've had to make those decisions. And largely, they seem to have done quite a good job. I mean, 2023 and 24 was quite sticky if you were trying to use ChatGPT and these other things. 2025 has been much more consistent in terms of availability. So I think they have, at least for those first few years, figured something out. But I wouldn't understate quite how difficult it is. But there is one thing that I do think makes it a little bit easier, which is we want a lot of compute. I mean, we being me, you, your listeners, the people they work for, with, who they employ, all of our customers want a lot of compute. And if you look out 5 or 10 or 15 years and say, do I think this 50-year trend of 65% increases in the amount of compute the world economy desires will stay the same, slow down, or speed up? I think it's a brave person to say who will say it'll slow down. So I wrote a piece saying there's a demand for infinite compute. What I was trying to observe is that it's not just about large language models. It's also about physics models to do predictions of materials. It's also about models that look at multiomics and biological data. It's about companies wanting to simulate distribution networks and figure out how best to route packages. There's so many things that we want to do in silico, because it's better to do them in silico in data centers than it is to literally drive trucks all around the continent of the United States to find the best route. And so in some sense, the answer is, well, you sort of want to build as much as the market will allow you to build, because you've got lots of applications that you want to use. And I'll finish off with a Fortnite story. So Fortnite is still a thing. I didn't realize. I thought that the wave had come and gone. But In 25, AWS, which is Amazon's cloud hosting business, lost a multi-million-dollar contract with Fortnite because they didn't have enough compute capacity. I mean, they'd spent the better part of $100 billion on compute, and they still didn't have enough, and they had to turn away business. So I think that tells you something.
Yeah, well, let me ask one more thing that makes it an even more complicated question. This all relates to ultimately to the electric grid, and different nations have better or worse electric grids. China's investing a ton. How does the nation state aspect play into decisions like this?
I wrote a piece back in 2024 in the New York Times where I said that America's AI fate in some sense hangs on its ability to get this underinvested grid to deliver electrons to chips. Power is really, really important and will continue to be important even as algorithms get optimized and become more efficient, and even as chips deliver more tokens per watt, because I think the demand for compute is really unbounded. I think one of the most interesting things that we have seen has been how the Gulf countries between the UAE and Saudi, now joined by Kuwait and others, have taken advantage of their extremely low energy prices and their permissive permitting regimes to become a hub for data centers. And they can do that because the power is cheap, they can build the data centers quickly, and ultimately what matters is millisecond ping time. And if you are using an interactive app, you don't mind 100 milliseconds, there and back, or 100 milliseconds.
But a self-driving car cares.
A self-driving car cares, a robotic surgeon cares, an agentic workflow that is churning away like it's in a software dark factory 24 hours a day probably doesn't care. So what they have done in the Gulf countries, I think, is a really, really interesting third pole, where within 100 milliseconds, you can serve about 4 billion humans, because you can get all the way to India, a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, and the whole of Europe, with the exception of bits of northern Scotland and Iceland. Let's see if that transpires as a real opportunity for them. But to your point about this sort of physical infrastructure and energy and data and pricing, lots of compute needs to be local, but an enormous amount of compute doesn't care where it is, so long as it's got the capacity and the electrons come in at low cost.
You recently wrote that 3/4 of Americans believe AI will negatively impact their lives, and that we've become, you called us, pragmatic addicts. We're dependent on AI, kind of know we have to get smart with it because otherwise we're going to get left behind, but also we really don't trust it. You called this a new kind of social bargain. We'll use the machine today, even though we suspect it'll take our jobs tomorrow. That sounds like a really unhealthy relationship that we should all get out of. How do we do that? How do we either, I guess, increase the trust so we don't feel like we're being taken advantage of? How do product makers actually facilitate that?
We never gave up on Instagram, and Instagram probably has the same set of attributes, right? Who feels good after 2 hours of scrolling reels?
Right.
And then who picks up Instagram and scrolls it again the next day or an hour later? I think it's a really hard problem. And this, to me, is one of the major tensions. And of all of the blocking and tackling that the frontier labs and the big tech companies have done, they've done this bit really inadequately. And there's a dissonance between the way that one can talk about AGI, artificial general intelligence, and artificial superintelligence, and ending work and going towards UBI, and the way that will get perceived by everyone else. And that dissonance is really stark. I think it will get more stark. I think it will play alongside the resistance that you're starting to see across the US, across communities, towards data centers being built near them. And I think these things will start to combine more and more. What has to happen, I think, is that the narrative has to change. And in what way does the narrative have to change? Well, we've talked extensively. I mean, our tech industry has constantly spoken about technologies removing jobs, which is not historically what they have done in over 5,000 years or 10,000 years. but people have made a strong philosophical case, which is not an economic case. It's a case about what happens when these systems get so powerful that they are, just better than us in every way. And I think that's a really useful philosophical set of questions to inspect. It's really at its heart about whether the world is entirely natural or whether there's some supernatural dimension that we can't control. Really interesting, but it's not that relevant to our jobs or our day-to-day. There are other questions that emerge. And so what we've started to see is the presentation, not just in the US, but also in China, of companies saying, our technology will mean you won't need to hire any more people. I mean, I've actually seen that as an advert for a Chinese robotics company that was exhibiting in an exhibition a couple of years ago. That's a very, very unhealthy narrative. It's also, in many cases, not actually correct. We don't know how fast the technology is going to improve. We do know that it's harder to really, really get it to work in large companies, although easier than many other technologies. But so long as you have this sense of terrifying threat, you'll never work again, and then some promise of an afterlife that involves UBI and cancer being cured and getting to explore the stars.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it is just a really poor way of trying to pitch something to anyone. I mean, it doesn't even appeal to me, and I've worked in this industry for 3 decades. But I think what can builders start to do, I think builders can think about how their tools might be designed around the augmentation of human capability. And Anthropic had some really interesting research back in 2025 where they looked at the differences between how enterprises used Claude and how the same types of people used Claude. And enterprise use cases were all about automation. Let's automate X, Y, and Z that a human was doing, whereas humans were all about augmentation. How do I do my job better? And there's some measure in that. And I think that question is something that is about the product marketing, not just about the product itself. It's about how we talk about it to the customer, about what this product might give them and how they might use it. And, within my team, and I'm happy to go into it if it's interesting, I think we found one way that has worked for us to tackle that particular dichotomy.
What is the way?
We use a lot of the AI tools, and people have subscriptions to APIs and the chatbots, and they use them for all their augmentations. But something else that we've done is reminded people if they do something 5 times in a week or 5 times in a day, they should build the automation that means they don't have to do that anymore. And that frontier moves further and further away until you get to a stage where you're doing something 5 times a month and you're saying, I'm just going to get this automated. But you will own that automation because you have access to the tooling. And some people use Zapier, some people use Lindy, other people use Python, and they go out and they automate key parts of their job. And then we've just started the process of saying to people, you've got to think about these as virtual members of your team. So you're now managing a team, even though you think of yourself as an IC. And what that's done is, if you look at someone's job and you say, oh, you were a researcher and you used to research podcast guests, and that used to take you 2 days a week, and now you have a series of agents that constructs the shortlist for you, and that process now is a one hour review. Well, that's great because that allows you to push quality. You had ambitions for the podcast or you had ambitions for the product. You can now move further up your backlog to those things that are going to move the dial. And that's a different way of talking about how you use these products and how you build them, which we as a small team of nerds can go off and do. But I don't think it's what happens when you open the Gemini Pro AI Suite API box in your unboxing video.
Yeah, I have a custom GPT. It's called Polly the podcast producer that helps me, knows the tone, the goal of the show, and it'll help me with guests and headlines and things like that. I want to get away from AI. I think there are actually other things we could talk about, maybe. And I want to, maybe, I don't know.
I don't know if I know anything else at the moment.
Yeah,
I'm so deep into it.
I feel the same way. I want to play you a question. This came in from, actually from the person who first suggested I read your work a couple years ago.
Right.
And so she submitted a question when she knew that I was going to be chatting with you. So let me call that up and play that for you.
Hi, Dan. Hi, Azeem. I'm Heather Myers. My firm, Spark Number 9, develops and tests business strategy using behavioral research. Here's my question for Azeem. AI seems to suck all the air from the room. What other big shifts should we be talking about that are getting drowned out by AI and its energy needs?
So the floor is yours. What should we be talking about? Because AI takes up, like she said, so much of the oxygen in the room.
Well, I love Heather, and she is a super, super smart person. So she's bound to have asked a great question. I have a lens that I use, which is the idea of time-space compression. So this is an idea that dates back to the 80s. There was a geographer called David Harvey, and he said, look, over the centuries, the intersection of finance and technologies shrinks the world. We think of these things as getting big. The speed of a plane is 600 miles an hour, but the plane is actually on the bottom half of the fraction. And on the top half of the fraction is the distance you have to travel. So everything gets smaller and smaller. And that means that timescales get smaller and smaller. AI is just part of that particular wave and direction of shrinking the world. We used to have to, I remember once spending a day and I got to the end of Reddit. This was back in 2007. You could get to the end of Reddit, and now all of Reddit is in ChatGPT because they have a licensing deal, and you just kind of can query and pull things out. So the notion of time-space compression is a really, really powerful one. We have largely enjoyed it over the last 40 or 50 years because you can get an MRI scan done in 2 hours by calling someone up or going on the Google and booking one, whereas it used to take a month or two. But as that process gets further and further on, I think it gets really psychologically destabilizing because we are used to being anchored to things that don't change every moment. When there was a Beavis and Butthead meme in the mid-80s, it lasted for months. I'm going to say something now, and it's going to have dated horribly. But for a moment, it was the bane of every high school teacher. 6'7".
Yep.
Doesn't last for a long time. The next one shows up.
It's because the unks are ruining it right now. We're all doing it, and the kids are like, "Please stop."
Well, that's what's
happening.
That's what always
I just had
happens.
this conversation yesterday. Yeah.
So I think for Heather, one of the key themes is the psychological destabilization of this ongoing time-space compression. And what do we as people want? What are the anchors we want to hold on to make sense of? Something has fundamentally changed in the last 15 years. So I remember having a BlackBerry, and there were some bankers who were really proud of the fact that if their BlackBerry bleeped in the middle of the night, they'd pick it up and just respond. And honestly, that is just sociopathic, or it's some kind of pathy. I don't know which one it is. We're now at a stage where there are 500 notifications coming into our iPhones every day. The technology is going faster than you or I really care about. And it's going to get faster because we're asking the AI systems to auto code and to self-improve and to run agent networks in the background. And by the way, we love those automated infrastructures. It's why you can order lights for your Christmas tree from China and they show up 2 days later. But we don't want to fight in that space. So I think one of the really big questions for companies is how do you construct things that operate at human scale and at human speed that are psychologically rewarding for us, emotionally rewarding, do things for us that we want them to do, take advantage of the fact that, the material science is improving on its own, but without us having to actually care about that. And we crossed some kind of a Rubicon where we were just being overwhelmed with stuff. And, we went from the Goom superstore in Moscow in 1980, which just had empty shelves, to just being under a blizzard of personalized, targeted, drop shipped AirPods cases on Instagram, and we now can't cope with it. And I think that for me is a really interesting tension, which builders can think about how they build into and how they serve that need and how they figure out how to serve it at a scale that allows them to make money.
Let me close with a question I like to ask. You've probably already given a few of examples of this already, but what is something that sounds like science fiction that you think is going to be not only real, but commonplace in the near future?
Sounds like science fiction, but will be commonplace. I mean, I think the LLM chatbots that we have on our phones today are already there. The things that you can do if you know how to ask the right questions from any of them, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, are straight out of science fiction. I built a risk model in a matter of an hour or so using one of these tools, and I was basing it on a product that I had paid for 20 years earlier. And I did this while I was on a stroll and on another stroll because I was preparing to talk to somebody quite important. I had loaded up who they were, what we wanted to talk about, and back and forth in Claude's voice mode. Claude simulated that person and coached me on how to go through that conversation over a 45-minute period. It's the same phone. I'm paying $20 a month for this. That is science fiction in any world.
Absolutely. And you're paying $20 a month for it, and they're losing what, 30? Is that going to change?
It's really hard to know. You would expect you'd expect companies to lose money at this time in their development. What I would say is that if you look at the unit economics of the existing models that are running in these apps, in other words, Claude 4 or 4.5 or 3, that model in of itself is probably making money because it was trained, it's being amortized over the 2 years it'll be used, 2.5 years it'll be used, and that is probably not a bad business, even if they're not at scale with all of their other overheads. But on a unit economics basis, it's quite possible that that's making money. A lot of the losses will be incurred on the next model that they are in training for that still hasn't seen a cent in revenue. And I think one of the key questions is going to be, do you have enough economic life on the models when you train them to make the money given the pace? Does pricing hold up or does it not hold up? And at some point, you've got to just stop training models that cost 10 times more than the last one, because you're going to run out of people and economy and stuff. So I think that there is these open questions, but there's something that's in the fundamentals of the technologies that say they're going to be really useful. I mean, for a couple of years, I've been saying, even if progress stopped right now, there's a great moment in the Liu Cixin science fiction series about the Trisolarians. I forget the name of the series now, but they send something called a solon, which is a small particle.
The three-body problem.
The three-body problem, that's right, yeah. They send the solon across to Earth, and it stops all scientific progress by tinkering with all of our machines, and it can move at the speed of light. And we have to manage without advanced technology. And in a way, right, if a solon appeared and just stopped these frontier labs improving, we've got plenty enough technology to really transform the way companies work and the way we work on a day-to-day basis. So I think there's this slightly odd moment where, in a way, we have what we need, but that development mill and research mill keeps turning.
Azeem, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
Dan, totally my pleasure. See you soon, I hope.
For sure. That's Azeem Azhar, the founder of Exponential View, and there are links to his newsletter and work in the show notes. I'm Dan Blumberg, and this is Future Around and Find Out. I am so excited to keep exploring with you. Go to futurearound.com to get the newsletter, to ask questions of upcoming guests, and to find more ways that we can build a better future together.